That was an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you, Carol. I am very honored to get to come and give one of the consortium talks, and I do want to say thank you very much to Carol Cohn for inviting me and for all of the work that you and Melissa Kay have done in organizing this event. And of course, thank you to all of you who have come to hear a little bit more about my work, and especially to my students who are here partly voluntarily. So I am actually really excited to share this work with you all. It actually comes out of the book that Carol mentioned a little bit earlier. And I want to start by telling you a couple of stories from that book, which was a book on headmen and traditional courts in rural South Africa. And it was based on interviews and observation of traditional justice processes, as well as a lot of sort of just recording headmen's daily activities. And so you'll hear me say we often because it was a collaborative work. We worked with some local field workers who were embedded in the community and were able to be on site very quickly and literally be there every day to record from the headmen what it is that they've done each day. The specific focus in this talk draws upon interviews and focus groups as well as some survey data relating to women's experiences in rural Msinga. Msinga is in KwaZulu-Natal, and I'll talk a little bit more about that context in a moment. But back to these stories regarding women who are facing human insecurity and limited access to justice. And they really are about instances when staying married seems or feels to a woman like her only means of keeping hold of marital property. So I start with Manovalo, who's an older sort of adult woman, really in her middle ages. And she was the victim of severe and repeated domestic violence by her husband, who had named Lujimpi, and everybody's name has been changed to respect their privacy, of course. And so Lujimpi, her husband, he wielded a gun to torment her whenever he was drunk, which unfortunately was quite often. And the matter had come before the Headmen's Council for Management only because Lujimpi had attempted to shoot a neighbor. And he was accusing this neighbor of harboring his wife at the time, when his wife had fled to the neighbor's house because her husband was yet again threatening her life, threatening to shoot her. And so when we interviewed Manovalo, she told us why she had not left her husband. And she said that she was aware that her husband was having an affair and that he was terrorizing her in order to get her out of the house. And in fact, in Manovalo's estimation, her husband would always threaten her with his firearm when he returned home from being with his other woman. And Manovalo was sure, she was absolutely convinced that he wanted to get her out of the house so that the other women would be able to come and take her place. And it emerged that no matter the cost, namely her own well-being and in fact her very life, and the mental disturbance that was suffered by her daughter, Manovalo was not prepared to leave the home because she said she had built it. She had literally built it with her own hands and with her resources. And so in tears, she told us that she was prepared to die if she had to do so in order to hold on to her home. Now, in its attempt to mediate the matter, the neighborhood council was actually unable to effectively manage the dispute. And here I pause to point out that what you have is a sort of multi-tiered justice system. And so the neighborhood gathering happens here at this level, and then the case kind of moves to the headman's purview where he gets to hear the case. And here I'm talking about the neighborhood gathering specifically. And they had attempted to resolve the matter, this conflict between Lujimpi and his wife over his mistress. But the council ended up telling Lujimpi that he should have gathered the family council, so actually that the matter should have started at this lower level with bringing together both Manovalo's family and Lujimpi's family together to hear the matter. And when they asked him why he hadn't done this sort of naturally known procedural thing or requirement, he was unable to provide a good reason for failing to do so. And so the council members then suggested that Gujimbi should actually rather move Manovalu back to her birth home instead of shooting at her, right? So in that sense, of course, that's positive because it's good to stop the shooting. But of course, this was limited in terms of solutions because that was not Manovalu's primary interest in this matter. In any case, they petitioned him to stop harassing his wife and instructed her to be respectful and patient toward him and his affair. And the term that's used in Msinga is generally indota ing, a man is a problem. So this is kind of universally known and accepted. And so, this is where this injunction to be patient towards him is expressed. Now I turn to a different dispute. In this dispute, Mazimele, another older sort of adult woman, and she actually was interesting because she had been nominated by her local community, what would formerly have been referred to as a tribe, to take a sort of traditional leadership position and serve on its legislative administrative council. But she was experiencing a sort of domestic violence. In fact, she was chased away from her married home by her husband because she refused to conceal a firearm at his request. Mazimele took the matter to the chief. So in her case, she's starting right at the top through a process that actually isn't, people often talked about it as, it's not a case, it's a cry or a plea or a petition. So it's sort of a mediatory process that is conducted by the highest authority, in this instance, the chief. And so she'd taken this matter to him, and there her husband, who had been summoned by the chief and had actually appeared, said he couldn't be with a wife, one of three, who, quote, refused to listen to him. So unable to reconcile the parties, the old chief found in Mazimele's favor, and she moved back from her brother's home where she'd been in hiding to kind of, get away from the trouble, and moved back to her marital home. When she moved there, she said it was because she didn't want to leave her children. But then her husband, Gwajisa, and his older wife, so wife number one, Mamdala, then moved out of the home. And in fact, the third wife wasn't really in the picture because she already lived in town. But basically, Mazimele remained alone at the home, which was the marital homestead. And she continued to make improvements to the home. But then Gwajisa, her husband, brought a charge against Mazimele for damaging existing property. In order to make the improvements, Mazimele had removed the rubble of houses belonging to the first wife, Mamdala. And she said that Mamdala had actually destroyed these houses before she had moved with her husband. But Gwajisa accused Mazimele of doing damage to, quote unquote, his land without his approval. Mazimele maintained that she would have moved to other land if her husband had given her some or helped her to obtain it by asking for land on her behalf. And so it's important to note here that at the time, women were still unable to obtain access to land independently of men. So Mazimele reported that it was obvious that her husband wanted to kill her. Unfortunately, taking this matter back to the chief seemed kind of exasperated because he said, he's unable to provide her with help beyond what he had already provided in the form of his order. And in that order, he had already found in her favor in this matter. So he recommended to her that she should go and report the matter to the police. And so in this instance, he's recommending that she should leave the traditional system and move out into the state system. So the police connecting up finally to the magistrate's court. So he said she should report the matter to the police, but meanwhile, Gwajisa, her husband, refused to return to the chief's forum, despite being summoned to further dialogue there multiple times, because he obviously knew that he wouldn't win the case there, but instead, he initiated civil proceedings against his wife through a lawyer. So again, state system now being used to sort of leverage against the traditional justice system, and so he's initiating the case in the magistrate's court. Mazimele, when we last spoke to her at that point, said that she was really concerned because she didn't have the financial means required to defend herself against such a lawsuit. So I stopped there with respect to these cases to ask the question, what do these examples teach us about gender and negotiating power within families and communities living under traditional leadership? Well, I would say that there are 7 important lessons that I will actually spend the bulk of this talk expounding. But I want to start with a couple of extra lessons about the political economy of justice and rights that frame my talk and may help to frame your understanding of the potential relevance of this talk to those outside of Msinga. So of course, Msinga is very far away from here. It's all the way in South Africa, about 13,000 kilometers or 8,000 miles away to be precise. And it's deeply rural, as you can see from the hut pictured here and the livestock sort of relaxing in that yard of this homestead. It's very traditional, and you can tell that from the dress of the women who are pictured up in the top right corner. And it's very expansive and dispersed, which you can see from the image in the bottom right corner of the women walking to the distant homes in the horizon. This map actually shows the police station as one of the most salient places there, in some ways at the center of the space, but actually the reality suggests that the picture is much murkier than this, and I think you might have a sense of that already from even just the diagram of the court system that prevails in Msinga. But for all of its differences with the United States, I would argue that Msinga's narrative is actually very familiar to parts of the US. It has a high propensity of guns. People there experience police brutality in the name of putting an end to crime and ridding the community of guns and the violence that comes with them. And children there are exposed to high levels of multiple forms, both interpersonal and structural, of violence. But the state focuses primarily and really rhetorically on the interpersonal and mostly neglects to address the structural. Furthermore, there is actually a lot of contestation over large swathes of the land in terms of which law will govern them and what law even actually means or is in that particular context, really. And the state's role as protector is blurred, as the state also acts often enough as violator, right? And so you see this here in the sign, who do you call when the cops murder, right? And then, of course, there's no bright line between social and legal injustice, as the two seem to flow into each other and come very much hand in hand. Nonetheless, the site of my study is South Africa, and I will spend the next sort of 20 minutes or so presenting the case for why its particular story warrants telling. So as I began to ask, what do the 2 examples I shared at the start teach us about gender and negotiating power within families and communities living under traditional leadership in South Africa? Well, I'd say the first thing is that it's all about power, and women have little of it with which to negotiate their security. So, as Carol shared, in terms of the work that I'd done before, I worked for the Rural Women's Action Research Program, and we did a lot of consultations around legislation that the government was proposing to find out what problems were presenting themselves in the rural communities that we were concerned with. And some of the things that were reported by women in those communities included women being evicted when their marriages failed, or when they were widows. They were evicted from their marital homes. Divorced or widowed women talked about returning to their natal homes, their homes of birth, when their marriages ended, but often finding that they were made unwelcome and evicted by their brothers, under the sort of patriarchal or patrilineal principle of the men actually own the property and the women are basically just, tenants in their home under their father's protection firstly, and then move into their marital home to being under their husband's protection. Unmarried sisters, therefore living in the natal home, often found themselves evicted by their married brothers after their parents died. And sons, in that case, were asserting that they alone inherited the land, even where their father may have actually chosen the daughter to be the responsible person for the family and for the family home. Married women talked about not being treated as people with rights in the land, which is treated as property of husbands and their natal family and their fathers. And wives were often not consulted on decisions regarding land use or transactions. And women actually were largely still treated as minors in their families and in their communities. women, especially single women, reported struggling to access residential land because traditionally residential sites are allocated only to men in these patrilineal areas. And then women talked about often being excluded from traditional institutions such as tribal and village council meetings where key decisions about land rights are taken, including women not being allowed to represent themselves or be represented in tribal councils and courts. They weren't allowed to address the meetings, and they were actually sometimes denigrated or even ignored when they tried to speak. And in fact, you know, it's important to note that in Manovalo's case, right, when we talk about that community council, at that level it was all men who were kind of deliberating and making the decision, but she hadn't gotten to have much say at all. And so these traditional courts that decide family and land disputes were found to be largely biased, actually, towards men because they were generally dominated by older men and were perceived by the women who we talked to favor men over women. A second lesson that I think that these stories actually teach us is firstly, is that apartheid distorted customary law by stripping women of the power they had under pre-colonial customary law, thus making it worse for women. And this may seem like a pretty stark claim to make, so a little background is actually probably warranted here. So it'll come as no surprise that the dictionary definition of state as a nation or territory considered as an organized political community under one government or the civil government of a country, that definition does not very well capture what is referred to in my title when I talk about where the state does not govern. It goes without saying that the South African state was formed through bloody conquest, and the colonial government, initially the Dutch arriving in 1652, relied upon a number of Roman Dutch legal constructs such as terra nullius and lex nullius to justify its plunder. So terra nullius means that the government at the time regarded the native occupants as uncivilized and therefore having not laid claim to ownership of the land. Hence the land was regarded as vacant, though it was actually occupied by people who lived there at the time. Lex nullius meant that for much the same reasons, the quote-unquote uncivilized pre-occupants of the land were without law and essentially lawless. So this map over here that shows William Henry Beaumont, who was a post-war land compensation claims subcommissioner who was appointed in 1882, and he basically put together this map while he was chairman of the Natives Land Commission under General Botha at the time. And the commission was tasked with finding land and defining boundaries for territorial segregation between black and white people. And so in March of 1916, the commission submitted its report outlining boundaries and recommending which areas were to be allocated to white people and which ones were to be allocated to black people. The result was a map where you have the black population legally allowed to possess land on initially only 6% of the territory, but then ultimately 13% of the territory, even though, of course, the black population made up the predominant majority of the population. Thank you. So the map from the commissioner was this map, and this is how they decided to disperse or distribute the land. And so it was initially 6% and then 13% of the land was accessible or given over to black people to inhabit, and the rest was for the white minority population.
So the colored bits are the
yes,
Bantustans.
so these are the homelands, the Bantustans, yeah. And in these reserves and black spots that are here in colored areas, the so-called natives were considered mere subjects of quote-unquote despotic chiefs. And this notion of the despotic chief was actually a trope for the purposes of saying, actually the governor general is the supreme chief. And so this white, political administrator then, or government official then becomes essentially acquires the powers of chiefs beforehand as they are imagined by the government as being despotic powers. So then from Law 4 of 1887 to the Land Act of 1913 to the Native Administration Act of 1927 to the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951, and the list goes on, the colonial union and then apartheid governments in South Africa tried to answer the question that Mahmoud Mamdani in Citizen and Subject calls the native question. In other words, they tried as a minority population to take charge of and control the majority population. And of course, those relative proportions is where there's a meaningful difference between South Africa and the US, but little else is that original because, of course, you know, the native question or the black Negro question, whatever question it is, has definitely been part of the narrative in the US as well. The way that the state problem solving manifested, as Mamdani details, is through indirect rule, which he terms decentralized despotism. That is the attempt to use, shape, and distort indigenous and traditional systems of law and governance to advance state objectives, especially in the period roughly between 1820, when the British settlers landed on the Cape, to 1994, when apartheid officially ended with the first democratic elections in South Africa. This native question has defined state formation and governance. Though the quote-unquote uncivilized natives subject to the system were supposed to be silent and were being deliberately silenced in the process, they resisted in forms including bringing cases before the state courts. Of course, the decisions of the courts, such as the appellate court in a case of Murky and others in 1925, where the court suggested that the, quote, native mind was more suited to a less democratic process, such as autocracy. Judges found in favor of the governments, again, the supreme chief, that is the Governor General, having, quote, the power to direct the removal by means of expulsion from the tribal property of any natives who have committed acts of insubordination and hostility to the duly constituted authority of any authority acting on behalf of such government. I want to highlight duly constituted authority because, of course, duly constituted authority is hardly a description that could or should be applied to the white Governor General as Supreme Chief of South Africa, given the conditions under which colonialism and apartheid were realized. Under these historical conditions of violent conquest and plunder, the process of state formation is therefore being fraught from the very beginning, and South African statehood was and continues to be highly contested from below. And so it's against this backdrop that I make the claim that apartheid's distortions of customary law stripped women of the power they had under pre-colonial arrangements in terms of customary law, thus making circumstances worse for women. A well-researched aspect of the political economy of rural areas like Msinga relates to prevailing notions of masculinity and femininity. I draw heavily on this research to understand and contextualize the ways in which Black men and women's socioeconomic positions and identities have been placed in perpetual crisis by the very severe poverty and social disruption that their families and communities have endured. Emasculated and infantilized by an oppressive system of government and unjust social experiment that deprived them of autonomy, material and physical security, as well as dignity, Black men were still in a somewhat better position than Black women. The early consequences of colonialism and apartheid for women, who were also denied the very goods that men were, included the denial of any independence they might have had under their traditional cultures. The extremely conservative colonial and apartheid governments perpetually fretted over women's purportedly loose morals, and the fact that, you know, Native women were allowed to choose their own spouses, for instance, was thought anathema. And later, their rapid urbanization. Men were generally co-opted by the state to use the levers of the colonial and apartheid state's power to strengthen their own position against women and young people in general. One of these levers was the government's explicit legislation of patriarchy. And so you have, for instance, the Black Authorities Act of 1951 specifically stating that a tribal authority shall, subject to the provisions of this act, generally exercise such powers and perform such functions and duties as within the opinion of the Governor General fall within the sphere of tribal administration and as he may assign to that tribal authority. In other words, the Governor General gets to make up whatever the rules are, whatever is considered tribal or customary law. And in fact, the Black Administration Act earlier in 1927 and then later in 1943 when it was amended had stated a new customary law that said, quote, a Native woman who is a partner in a customary union and who is living with her husband shall be deemed to be a minor and her husband shall be deemed to be her guardian. So women and young people were disproportionately disadvantaged by a system that privileged, quote, the adult male members of the tribe, as exemplified in the Black Administration Act, which spoke about and provided for men as the only participants in local decision-making. And in fact, the Constitutional Court has talked extensively about the ways in which this was dissonant with some of the pre-colonial past, in terms of which women had actually had a significant degree of influence. And even though these traditional communities were patriarchal, they were also matriarchal. And so in a sense, the matriarchal and patriarchal elements held each other in tension and held each other in check to a degree. Nonetheless, the court found that, of course, we've got to recognize that no system was actually perfect, and so there is a need still to continue to talk about the developments with a view to addressing the vulnerability of women and ensuring that their rights to equality are robustly protected under the Constitution. Another significant element of the political economy of these areas is the extreme poverty and lack of human security more generally that I mentioned earlier. And this has resulted from the systematic oppression by the colonial and apartheid governments on these communities that I'm talking about. And it's also the sense of powerlessness with which many ordinary people are faced as a result of that sort of systematic and structural body or form of disenfranchisement and disempowerment. So in essence, I guess I adopt a political economy approach for the purpose of interpreting historically and institutionally the opportunities for and constraints on the effective realization of rights, security, and justice by state and non-state actors, both separately and collectively, that are presented in, through, and around law in its pluralistic forms. And I'm interested in this particular talk about, I'm interested in the impact thereof on women. And so that leads me to the third lesson, that the stories that I opened with, these women's narratives, teach us. And that is that women's security is highly embedded and contingent upon the reciprocal relationships that make up customary communities and rights within them. And so for that, I actually draw upon the work of John Comerf and Simon Roberts, who do extensive work sort of talking about the nature of customary law as a negotiated legal system where actually, even though there is a body of norms and principles, they exist in a repertoire. And as to which norms will rise to the level of being definitive in any particular situation, that is determined on a case-by-case basis, depending on the negotiations that take place between the parties and the authorities in that particular case. And this is something that you actually see very clearly within the context of dispute resolution within these communities, is people kind of leveraging different norms and different principles and values to make arguments for why it is their interpretation of the law and their interpretation of what law should prevail in that particular case should be the one that is given primary sort of power and application in that particular set of norms. And so this notion of this notion of law is actually very different from the notion of law that state laws sort of apply, and it's very heavily dependent upon the power that people have to negotiate, right? The power that people have to present their case, present their arguments, and actually make a compelling case for why their interpretation of the normative repertoire and which norms should rise to the level of definitive or authoritative in any particular case. The extent to which they are able to make that case is really important, and that revolves around power. And I guess you might want to ask the question, well, where is the state or its government when such local negotiations are taking place? Well, I presented an interpretation of the state earlier as being contested, basically, and I would present a similar notion around governments. And for both of these concepts, I sort of draw upon the work of Danish scholar Christian Lund, who makes the argument that the legitimacy of governing authority is actually constantly contested. And he writes specifically, when an institution authorizes, sanctions, or validates certain rights, the respect or observance of these rights by people constitutes recognition of the authority of that particular institution. In order to understand how political power is exercised, we therefore need to have an eye for the processual aspects of the formation of public authority, and in particular how it takes place in day-to-day social encounters. Yet legitimate authority is not necessarily legitimate authority for good, but must be vindicated and legitimated through a broad array of political practices. In essence, such practices constitute the negotiation of public authority in a particular context. And so essentially negotiation comes to the fore again, right? That even the authorities themselves are negotiating the legitimacy of their authority and the legitimacy of their power in that situation. And so in essence, I argue that the state, as viewed from above, where it is meant to quote unquote conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of a state, organization, or people with authority, as this dictionary definition would suggest, does not in fact govern. And this is true whether you interpret govern to mean control, influence, or regulate a person, action, or course of events, or serving to decide a legal case. And in fact, I think it's true even if you take govern to refer, with respect to the state, with respect to its own behavior, look at governing in terms of conducting or controlling itself, right? The state does not even do that very effectively. Especially in places such as in Msinga. And I want to demonstrate that by returning to Manuvalo's matter and observing that firstly, though she did once call the police to help her out of her domestic violence situation, they came, and when they didn't find her husband Kujimpi there, they left a message and never looked back. And then secondly, though technically serious crimes such as, presumably illegal possession and misuse of a firearm, as is in the case of Kujimpi, an assault with the intention to inflict grievous bodily harm, as Manuvalo and her daughter had experienced repeatedly, and also their neighbor, as Kujimpi was threatening their lives as well, fall exclusively within the purview of the police. But the police themselves were in a sense peripheral to the broad attempts to resolve this matter. In fact, they were barely mentioned as the case unfolded and transformed, progressing from forum to forum within the vernacular dispute management system, and finally lying unresolved even there. Perhaps then what is most important in this approach to understanding the state and the processes that comprise and oppose its formation and the legitimation of its authority to govern that I've adopted from Lund is that it incorporates what is championed by Sally Anglo-Mary as a concept of culture that allows for agency and contestation in situations with multiple and contradictory cultural logics and systems of meaning. So evidently, from the first two stories I told and how I have attempted to unpack them, you can deduce that an important kind of wrong that adult women are obviously particularly vulnerable to is related to their relative material insecurity. Here, the distinction between older adult women and younger adult women is worth making. I've previously actually written about the link between the social embeddedness of Msinga women's access to land and their vulnerability to or protection against eviction. The interviews for that article were conducted with an older generation of married and divorced, as well as separated, widowed, and unmarried adult women. But the present data set that I'm referring to in this talk suggests that there may be some generational shifts taking place in this regard, particularly with respect to the decisions that women themselves make when they're faced with trouble in their marriages. And one sees this shift evidenced by the difference between the two cases that I opened this talk with and the two case illustrations that follow. In short, in the cases opened with, you see two older adult women refusing to leave their marital homes for reasons of holding on to the property that is their home and livelihood in which they've invested meaningful resources. They do this even at the real risk of their lives. By contrast, the instances we came across of younger adult women who were faced with marital troubles were matters in which the women had left their marital homes. And so I start with the case of Dodecanese Mata. This woman had received assistance from her birth family in loading movable material belongings from her marital home onto a rented truck and taking them back to her birth family with her. Dodecanese was not technically married to the man, but was living with him as one who was married to him. And this is part of the sort of processional nature of marriage in these communities as not being a once-off event, but a sort of series of events. And they also had children together. And so her in-laws laid a formal claim after this sort of looting of property in their home. They laid this claim before the Headman's Council against her and her family for damaging the marital family's property and taking some property that was not theirs in the moving process, particularly the refrigerator. Part of Dodecanese's justification for leaving and her father's reason for deliberately taking some of the husband's belongings was that the husband, Slingo, was not maintaining their children. As it turned out, however, the refrigerator actually belonged to Slingo's senior wife. In the Headman's Council meeting, agreement was reached between the parties that the refrigerator would be returned in exchange for 2 cows as damages and maintenance for the children the daughter had had with the man she had left. So that was Dodecanese's matter. In another matter, the woman, Makpinga, just left her in-laws as though she were returning home, only for the weekend, and then she never returned. On 2 attempts, with the help of the headmen's and the chief's councils, because the matter really went through all of the stages of the process, on 2 attempts with the help of those forums to have her return to her marital family, Makpinga said before the forums that she would return, and yet she did not. The forums pleaded with her to at least tell them why she didn't want to return, if indeed she didn't want to return. She would not say, but told the forums that she would return. It later emerged that her husband, Cheyenne, was actually beating her. And the headmen in her area then told us that they'd ultimately managed to elicit a commitment from her husband that he wouldn't beat her again. And yet, she still did not return. In the end, Cheyenne was harassing the headman of the ward in which Makpinga's birth family lived, asking him, what's your job if it's not to reconcile people and make this happen? And the headman, got annoyed with these comments, of course, and he reported to us that he obviously could not make the girl return, and he wouldn't tell the man to go and retrieve his Loyola cattle. But in the end, Makpinga really did refuse to return and didn't tell anyone the final reason why. And her family agreed to return the cattle to the groom's family, which was a long way to drive the herd because they lived in a distant ward in another traditional community. Now, in each of these cases relating to these younger adult women leaving their homes, the birth and marital families together attempted to get the women to return, but were unsuccessful. In the end, what was apparent was the inability of the families and vernacular forms to compel these younger women to return to their husbands. And in fact, in another matter altogether that I talk about in the book, but not here, but this woman, Zama, had left her children and was refusing to return them to her husband's family as culture seemed to demand. She was appealing to the civil court system to defend her. And unfortunately, though she was not finding much luck and actually believed that her husband had bribed the court clerks, and that's why she wasn't getting anywhere with that process. But again, you see people leveraging the state system for the purposes of trying to sort of work around the traditional system. But of course, because these are not randomized control experiments, there's no denying that there are many variables in these disputes, right? Concerning older and younger adult women. The personalities of the parties involved, for one, the family's respective means for another. However, in my observations, some weight must be given to the generational differences between the women involved and how much they feel they can step outside of conventional norms and expectations. The younger adult women seem to experience more freedom to leave their marital homes. Interestingly, this is so in both communities that I was doing the study in, and one of these traditional communities is very conservative, and the other one is actually a little bit more open to progressive change. In fact, in that second community that's more open to progressive change, the women's ability to actually be more independent as actors is as a direct result of the older women's conduct, because when when one of the women, Magdala, I can't remember her name, but she who had left her house, had to go to the chief to petition, and then came back and moved to the house, and then her husband was, suing her. She had actually, because she had been on this traditional council, she had been one of the women who had advocated for women to be able to gain access to land independently of men. And so her community had reformed its principles for the purposes of allowing women independent access to land. And so these younger women are now benefiting from her actions because, as it happens, Zama then, on the other hand, is able to then go and apply for land independently without having to, make these, having to sort of tolerate the injustices that she has been experiencing in her marital home. So it would seem also that, so the one part is with respect to the women and the younger women's orientation and the freedom that they experience, but the other part is with respect to the forums and how they regard these women. They actually observe this greater freedom that's experienced by the younger adult women with some degree of indulgence, in fact, really resignation. It's as though the vernacular forum members, these traditional justice forum members, regard these younger women as quote-unquote lacking respect and discipline and being somewhat beyond the control of the forums. And of course this has to be read within the context of, the sort of notions that sort of permeate the air of rights and the Constitution as having given women all of these senses and ideas about being equal to men, and you can't even discipline children anymore because it's their right to speak back and talk back to their parents. And similarly with women, they think that they can talk back to their husbands. You can't even discipline them anymore with corporal punishment because they are protected by the Constitution and rights. And so within all of that context, you find that with some persistence on a young woman's part, in the end, the forums seem to largely accept that they cannot force these women to do anything that they don't want to do. And so the forums just drop the matter. And in these instances, the fact that many disputes actually go unresolved in these communities and simply just lapse because the forums cannot take the matter forward, that can actually be of some help to the more vulnerable women faced with relatively strong husbands in the dispute. And so, to wrap up, I guess, I would say that the lessons that we learn from this sort of generational shift, or we learn about this generational shift, are firstly that women negotiate under a different political climate with the Constitution having come into being. And since its enactment, you actually find the attitude of their communities is that the government really supports women, and so the communities have to be attentive or sort of be a little bit more careful in how they deal with the women because of the government support. And so this allows women to gain greater material security. And in fact, the Community Agency for Social Inquiry did a survey in 2010 that tried to sort of track this change over time and was able to record the fact that actually the 1994 moment and the government's enactment of the Constitution and the enactment of women's rights as being protected, and the enactment of customary law as being subject to rights have all contributed to this idea that the government backs women, and so I shared that actually with respect to the way that people think about rights and women's and children's rights, and unfortunately men perceive it as being a disadvantage to them, and perceive it as being a function of they're being underappreciated or not being backed by the government and at the expense of women. And of course these views actually have sort of often contradictory impacts in terms of how they shape interactions situationally in day-to-day life. But I think that the way that people think of them, these rights, and how they frame people's consciousness of them, even just symbolically, is really important. And I'm actually going to skip this for reasons of time. If you can ask me again, take your rights then and sleep outside on the street. You can ask me during the Q&A. But suffice it to say, I think that one of the important things is to think about rights within the context of not just, so I'm drawing from Nicola Lacey here, where she talks about how we should think of rights not just in formal, but equally in substantial terms. And if the underlying value of rights lies in human equality, we have to think about the content and enforcement of rights in terms of their equal value to differently situated subjects. And so the question I ask is, what does that practically mean in the case of South Africa? And that's not entirely clear, but I think one thing that it does mean is that the ways in which the laws in South Africa respond to the changes that happen locally in communities by sort of entrenching patriarchy in more and more stringent ways is obviously the wrong way to respond to that. And one of the ways in which South Africa is changing quite dramatically is, studies have shown that at least from the 1960s, but quite possibly from the 1920s, marriage rates have been declining in Black communities. And this is linked very much in many ways to some of the political economy and social economy pieces I talked about earlier with respect to sort of entrenched legal provision for enforcing patriarchy, but it's also linked to factors that actually have to do just simply with the ways in which women are recognizing that they have this permission to be independent, and they don't necessarily have to have a man in their life in order to live a good life. And in fact, often women feel like men sort of drag them down a little bit in terms of within the sort of economic circumstances of men being often unemployed and often sort of quite strongly addicted to alcohol. Within these communities, women feel that in many ways they can actually do better being on their own and sort of raising their kids on their own. But the government doesn't take that into account, the fact that the nuclear family or the marriage-based family is no longer at the center of community formation within these particular communities and legislates as though it is, and that actually is disadvantageous to women who are specifically choosing to set a different path for their lives. Another thing is that customary law legislation that has been passed tends towards changing the balance of power in favor of traditional leaders and male minorities. And I say male minorities because actually women make up roughly 59% of the population in these rural communities. And so actually men are in the minority, and yet the laws sort of entrench many of those patterns and behaviors and power dynamics that I said earlier contribute to women's feeling that they are disempowered and disenfranchised within their communities and unable to negotiate for greater security. And then the final thing is that, as I started to talk a little bit about, the implementation of laws that exist, that the democratic government is actually putting in place, is itself contributing to the ways in which women are disadvantaged, whereas actually when women are able to be part of these decision-making bodies, they can actually make a difference, as you saw in the form of this woman contributing to changing the norms in her community to allow women to be able to access land independently of men. And these are things that the government is not being very, very good at supporting in its policies and norms. So with that, I guess I would just say that I think that the context that I did my research in is one in which you see how justice is really murky. And the definitions of justice are constantly competing both between parties who are locally embedded and between the communities and the state. And yet I guess I would say at the end of the day, I do think it's really important that the government come back to this idea of recognizing that rights need to be operationalized within context, and so they need to be meaningful to the people based on the context in which they find themselves, and more than that, ultimately that gender matters or power matters. And so it's really important actually that even, you know, though the picture that I present is one that's somewhat dismal in terms of women's positions in their traditional communities, it's also really important to highlight that women's positionality is being continually negotiated and actually can have levers of power that can be really transformative and important, but sadly these are often constrained and trampled by the state's policy decisions and laws. And so I think part of my takeaway from these findings is a message that gender and in fact generational matters are indeed power matters, and perhaps it is to state the obvious, but I think it's not always clear to me that this is as obvious to lawmakers, but which class of people government engenders with power through its laws is a critical question to ask. And so I thank you for your attention.
Since we have at least a few minutes before the class is supposed to end, I want to invite students from the class to have the first comments and questions.
Well, our class ends at 6:45.
Oh, it's 6:45?
Yeah, so you got time. You can give other people time first.
All right. Well, then I take it back. But I do want to encourage the students to be speaking here, because we faculty are more used to doing it. But having said that, do you want to?
I mean, I'll take a pause here, see if anyone does want to ask a question.
Take your breaks, then sleep outside.
Oh. Yeah, so it's actually, it was, while I was collecting data, not in this field site, but in a different field site for my PhD, I was doing research specifically on ways in which rights had sort of trickled down from like the state level, the constitutional level, and in constitutional court cases with respect to women's inheritance of land and inheritance generally. And you know, I would go to people in the community. It was participant observation, so I was basically just sort of hovering around all the time. And there was like a big sort of community meeting. I went up to these women and I asked them, hey, so, you know, can you tell me what you understand about rights? And they basically said to me, oh no, we don't know anything about rights. Like, you know, sometimes we hear them talk about rights on the radio, okay. And then that was it, and I was like, okay, well that was a very abortive conversation. So I just basically decided to just sit there with them and just kind of hang out. And next thing I knew, these women were talking about rights, and they were talking about them in a different way from clearly the way that they had understood my question. And basically what they said was, you know, they were talking about a woman who had initiated a case against her husband to have him pay maintenance for their children. And they lived in the same house, but she had literally gone to the magistrate's court to go and apply for him to be, you know, compelled by the law to pay maintenance. And when she, so having done this, these women are now talking about this and being like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. I would never do such a thing. Like, you know, when you live in this house with this person, like, how could you do that? And they start talking about the fact that, like, you know, if, you know, it's these women who think that it's because of their rights, that their rights allow them to do these things. right? And they look at me and they're like, well, one of the older women looks at me and she says, oh, you know, now that I'm this old, they come and they tell me about these rights. They should just leave me alone. These rights are fine for, you know, you young women or whatever, looking at me. And the other lady then looks at me and she says, oh, no, they're not even fine for you because, you know, take your rights then and sleep on the street. You know, and essentially for these women, it boiled down to, you know, if your husband is putting a roof over your head, he's putting food on your table, you know, he's like not like beating you to a pulp, like you are well covered. Like that is, you know, you do not need those rights. Yeah, and your kids, right? And so like you do not need those rights. Those rights are disruptive. And I guess it's from that place that I think about how rights are, it's important to interpret and understand rights in a contextual manner because, you know, these women are interpreting rights in terms of this distant form, right, that is in the Constitution or in the Constitutional Court, and it's this kind of top-down model that's going to come and like completely disrupt your life and make it difficult for you to build a good family, build a good community. But actually, they do have a conception of rights because clearly they're talking about, well, at least I have a right to my husband providing food for me. I have a right to my husband providing shelter for me. You know, so needing to sort of think with people about how do you make rights intelligible and usable within their particular context. Sure. Feel free to go. Nobody else is raising their hand.
Thank you so much for this. This is a very rich situation that you brought in front of us, and so many different things. I wonder, so just thinking about the generational shift that you were talking about before, do you think that there are changes in the way that people think about what it means to be, in the case of the community, I'm presuming Christian, right? And so there's this notion that's heavily embedded about the way that, you know, as a moral person, as a good woman, right, you have an obligation to stand with your husband, you have an obligation to bear his children and bear all of his misbehavior, right, because that's what the Bible tells you you should be, and the minister tells you you should be doing. Is there a difference generationally in terms of the way that the younger women are understanding those things, do you think? Or is it something else that's coming from a, you know, as you say, the sort of civil society kind of discourse?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So it's an interesting community because it's actually, there's quite a lot of syncretism. So there definitely are people who are there who are like, I'm very clearly Christian, going to church every weekend or whatever, but I'd say most people are more kind of like traditional like belief system. And so they would say that it's coming primarily from like traditional beliefs. But of course that's not to say that it doesn't have Christian sort of undertones or overtones, right? Because especially a lot of the sort of mandated patriarchy, right, by law, was actually coming out of like the Christian sort of mission, right, tradition as well. And so, and there are other ways in which like Christian discourse has permeated these communities, right? And so, for instance, things like being the sons of Ham, right, like, which is one of the ways in which like discrimination was and segregation was sort of justified, right? And so there's definitely that, and I can see how there are elements of that, but they would, at least in terms of their expression, their explicit statements, they would say that these are traditional norms, that you know, these sort of patriarchal principles are very much traditional. And again, it comes, you know, to this the saying of a man is a problem, right? So like you can't change the nature of a man. It's just the way he is. It's like naturally he's going to have a desire for multiple partners. He's, you know, going to drink a lot, you know, all of these things. But I think what is shifting is that the women are thinking, like, I don't have to put up with that. right? Like, and that I think is coming partly from a combination of like modernity, if you will, right? So sort of external messages, because they're connected, they're reading newspapers, they're watching television, they're listening to the radio, as well as the sort of civil society discourse, right? Like even in the popular culture, like there are songs like "Let's go 50-50," like which is basically like men and women should like have 50-50 equal split, and so those things I think are starting to permeate. But I think some of it is also quite genuinely around like the sort of crisis that has to do with the political, economic, and social dynamics of the last 100-odd years, where men actually can no longer provide the things that are part of what makes a man, right?
Or if you go and you become a migrant laborer, right, and you're sending money back.
Right.
You're not there physically, right?
Right.
You're sending the money.
Exactly. So, and unfortunately, the migrant labor system has all but collapsed. And so, I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, unfortunately in the sense that these are economies that are dependent on it, right? And so that means that there is no money coming into these communities. Obviously that doesn't, the migrant labor system did not help family social fabric, right? But the other thing is that in order to compensate for that, right, in order to try and sort of support communities, the government has put in place social grants. And those come in two primary forms: children's grants, which come to the mother in most instances, because if you're not married, like it's coming to the mother to be able to support her children. And because women outlive men, and men are often far away or drinking their money, as the sort of popular discourse will go, the retirement grants, the pension grants, are coming primarily through women as well, right? So in a sense, you're finding a situation where women have a source of income that isn't men, and men are no longer able to really play that role of being a source of income and support for their families materially. And so women have a really very real choice of, I can be independent and I don't have to put up with all of this in order to be materially provided for. Yeah, so I think it's a complex set of factors, sort of, an interplay. Yeah.
Well, thank you for a very nuanced description of a complicated set of arrangements. I'm wondering about how polygamy falls into this. You mentioned at one point that a man had a girlfriend, and I was wondering, like, why the girlfriend was a girlfriend and not a wife, or so anyway,
That's a really great question, and it's actually very connected to these dynamics. It actually turns out that polygamy is like, very, very rare now. It's down to at most 2%, and so polygamy is not happening as much. Although, of course, where it is happening, this would be one of the places where it's happening more. So this could single-handedly represent, 1 or 1.5% of the population. But the thing is, polygamy is premised on this idea of the man being able to provide, right? And so being able to establish a homestead and give each of the women their own sort of home and established set of resources for them and their children. And so, when men are no longer able to establish a homestead, even just to support a single wife, then it actually becomes really difficult to say, I'm going to now marry multiple partners. But that aside, I think that I haven't studied this myself. I'd be interested, Heidi, if you know any more about this than I do. But I'm not sure that polygamy has always excluded other partners. Do you know what I mean? Like I think in principle that's the idea, right? It's like you don't need to have affairs when you have 3 wives. But I don't think that that necessarily plays out that way, right? And the wives are supposed to be primarily, part of the decision, maybe at least consulted, maybe in some instances they even choose the subsequent wives. But that I don't think has necessarily always played out that way. And so I'm not 100% sure that, polygamy has necessitated that men are necessarily sort of sticking with that lot of wives, which maybe then is part of how you come back to this idea of ndodini, right? Like a man is a problem. Like even when he has, 3 wives at home, he still goes out and finds another one, So yeah, that may potentially be a thing. But then of course, like, it's interesting how that may interconnect with HIV and AIDS, because that's another component of this that's actually quite significant, right? Is the ways in which communities have been decimated and men have been, and their sort of sense of male identity and masculinity has been affected by the nature of HIV and AIDS, and the reality that actually women contract it more easily than men do, and it is often through their male partners, right? And so, yeah, so I think that also may be a contributing factor to women being like, ooh, I'm not sure, that I necessarily, want to sort of set up with this person.
I mean, I don't know if it's completely relevant, but in Kenya, there's, the sort of the notion of, well, the first thing is, Kenyan Parliament just a few years ago passed a law that was basically enabling common law relationships to become legally binding, so that they essentially turned girlfriends into wives with legal rights, which previously had, in Kenya, you were only allowed to have one wife if you weren't Muslim. But the other thing about wives is that there are gifts of cattle and there are other kinds of things that mean that you have social rights and responsibilities to your wife's family, right? And so girlfriends are people that you engage with as individuals, right? And so there's no, that whole aspect of the relationship is completely different. And, there are all sorts of different motivations for getting into one of those relationships on the women's side. But, I think, again, part of this comes back down to this notion that, men are considered to be the source of economic security, even if there are these other sort of frameworks, right? And so if you want to be secure and you don't have an education and you don't have employment prospects, then
And what's interesting, just with respect to that point, is that the South African Constitutional Court had the opportunity to make the same decision. So a case was actually brought, which was advocating for that, and they nixed it. And so basically, like, partners who are not, married or formally married with the intention of being married, if you're not in that situation, you then do not acquire all of the rights or responsibilities that come with that. So there's no common law marriage in that sense. Yeah. So and then
just to add to the point about Kenya, it's also that legislation was passed before women could actually inherit land from either their father's side or their mother's side. So what would happen is husbands would have these, I can hear it in Swahili, but I can't think of it in English, like side plans, or basically like girlfriends on the side, and they would only come to light with their children when the husband died. And the problem with that was a lot of these women then didn't have the right, or weren't viewed as legitimate partners, so they didn't have the rights that they technically should have within human rights international law. So that's why they passed it. Also just because a lot of members of parliament at the time did have those issues, so they were trying to like ensure that the embarrassment in the end, if it happened to them, would surpass the whole situation.
So Rajani and then Juan.
So thanks, Sindiso. I'm sorry for coming in late. But you mentioned, the HIV/AIDS context and how that might have affected or is affecting discursive rights in not the urban centers, but in the rural communities. And I wonder if you talk a little bit more about that, because the the whole HIV/AIDS activism around in South Africa is very much predicated on the issue of rights and the right to free antiretrovirals, and that language is permeated a great deal through all parts of South Africa. So I'm wondering how that has played any kind of role in the tension between rights and customary law in South Africa.
So, I mean, I think of a place like Msinga, and I think that, they would be familiar with that, but like it wouldn't be sort of front and center of their consciousness.
But I think that, it's insofar as it sort of falls within this sort of larger discourse about rights and the ways in which rights are this like external force that then comes and basically tells us how to live our lives, and it directs us to live our lives in ways that actually contradict the way that our traditional norms would have us live our lives. I could see how it could definitely have sort of fed into that. I mean, most of the work on HIV/AIDS and in places like Msinga has really kind of talked mostly about the ways in which it has contributed to shaping identity, and especially male identity, and some of the work that's talking about the generational shift within men as a population as opposed to women, is talking about the ways in which younger men are starting to appreciate that actually having multiple partners is not that desirable, because of the ways in which the virus actually can steal your virility, right? You cease, on the one hand, like over the last century or so, and maybe half century even, there's been this development of this idea of traditional masculinity in South Africa, or sort of virile black masculinity that revolves around multiple partners. And there's been work that's been done to sort of counteract that and say, actually, that was something that has developed in recent time, whereas actually previously the idea of masculinity was built around restraint. It was, even when you were engaging with a girl extramaritally, you wouldn't go beyond a certain point, and so you wouldn't be actually having penetrative intercourse with them. And so, these ideas of, having multiple partners, multiple conquests, are things that have evolved in more recent times. And so, not to say that younger generations are sort of moving towards sort of reclaiming that narrative, but definitely appreciating more and more that, having multiple conquests doesn't necessarily kind of make you more of a man, especially when you see how men how their vitality is taken by the virus, right? How you die with, very limited dignity, especially when you are living in a poor rural community. And so I think that has definitely framed things, and I think that the publicity campaigns have certainly sort of had some influence in shaping women's sense of, you need to learn to say no. And of course that's difficult, and there are a lot of studies that talk about these sort of economic conditions and these sort of power or political conditions within relationships that make it really difficult for women to say, yes, I'm actually going to stand up to my husband and say, no, we can't have sex, or no, we can't have sex without a condom, or whatever. And so I do think that could potentially be a contributor to women's sort of, opting out a little bit and making choices as to being committed to somebody or not being committed to somebody in marriage. But of course, it's also worth noting that women are still having children. So, it's kind of not entirely clear that women, by opting out of marriage, are necessarily opting out of having families and opting out of having sex. So, it's kind of a complicated picture in that sense. But I think that all of that discourse, all of that sort of publicity campaign is definitely having an impact. But the stats also show that, like, you know, it's still pretty bad. I mean, South Africa is still,
And especially among the younger generations in these
Right.
areas, that's what appears to be happening with the incidence is higher with adolescents.
right, right. So that's the other difficulty, is that actually there hasn't been as significant an impact in terms of HIV prevention or the spread of HIV in South Africa as you would have hoped to see. So I think, yeah, that leads one to question, I guess, how much impact that discourse and those campaigns actually are having.
I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned how a lot of these people, both men and women, were leveraging kind of the state legal system to sometimes get a win in the more traditional legal framework. At first I wanted to ask you if there have been changes in representation at the state legal system of more women being there and being able to kind of influence the kind of legislation that's passed, and if that's created different avenues for women to maybe have more to grab onto from the state system in order to use within the legal, traditional legal framework.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish my answer was more positive. So, I mean, South Africa has the sometimes second, sometimes third highest number of women in parliament. So after Rwanda, which is first, and Senegal is our other sort of arch nemesis, I guess, rival. And so in that sense, that's been a positive, right? But the difficulty is perhaps around the structure of our political system, because it's very party-based. Essentially, because, so the quota that South Africa has for women in parliament is through the ANC, the African National Congress, which is the ruling party. And it has a pretty sort of solid whip system, right? So making sure that cadres stay in line with like the sort of centralized policy. And so one of the difficulties that gives rise to is the fact that I think women within the party have not necessarily been as independent as thinkers as they may potentially have been. And of course there have been things that they have done that are positive. But you know, one of the difficulties is that the prevailing notions of custom and tradition in parliamentarians' minds, and actually I think in many urban South Africans' minds, are very romanticized, right? It's these ideas of like, we're this harmonious community and there just, you know, isn't any like strife or tensions, like, you know, men take care of their women and, you know, so patriarchy is good, you know? So unfortunately, like you have not seen as much advocacy from the perspective of the women within parliament on behalf of rural women. And I think it's because they actually mostly just don't know what rural women's lives are like. They actually just do not know. And so, and I think another part of the disconnect is around the ways in which people understand tradition and custom are actually very much, so people talk about it as being, you know, pre-colonial notions of custom that they're referring to, but they're actually, you can look at the literature and see how those are colonial inventions, right? And so things like, no, men have always been the dominant forces within our communities. That is just patently untrue, right? Because we can actually show the like archaeological data that contradicts that. We can also show the like legislative, you know, documents that show this was the point at which the colonial governments introduced this principle, or the commission reports, right? In like the British commissions where they were talking about, oh my goodness, these Ndebele women get to choose their own spouses. This is like mayhem. Like how could they possibly do this? And of course they're coming from, you know, England. At the time, women do not have these rights. And so for them it's shocking, but you know, for that then becomes the law, and women in South Africa lose their right to make decisions for themselves and lose their right to, acquire property independently and all of these things. But those are things that are being internalized both by the communities themselves and by policy and rule-makers in ways that are actually very destructive. And so that's the position from which they are operating when they are, sort of reenacting the, and reinscribing the norms that prefer patriarchy and sort of entrenched patriarchy. Yeah. So sorry, it's not a bad answer.
So, what did the colonial powers, were they trying to, drive a wedge between men and women by legislating patriarchy, or what was their advantage, what was their goal in doing that? And I also want to ask, do you think the society will be able to, kind of overcome those years of having patriarchy legislation?
So with respect to the first question, I think that was part of their agenda. I mean, some of it was like, I mean, this is part of the thing about colonialism. Some of it was premeditated and orchestrated, but some of it was just kind of accidental. Like people were just kind of bumbling through, sort of like trying to figure out how do we deal with the circumstances. Like we are in the heart of darkness and we don't really know what to do. How do you manage the situation? So some of it was definitely kind of accidental. We sort of stumbled upon this, and it was trial and error, and it was inconsistent from place to place. But some of it was kind of deliberate, and I guess I'm inclined to say that with respect to patriarchy, there was a significant proportion of deliberation, because there was definitely the sense of, oh my goodness, we cannot have women running wild, right? And that's coming from a place where women are still pretty much leashed, and so it was a sort of transference in that sense, and strengthening the position of the men means that you can control the women, but it also means, and I think that this is interesting in terms of continuities with today, right? It also means that you have more sort of centralization of power, right? And so if you think about it, if the colonial government or the apartheid government says that the traditional leader, this male, gets to represent the community and have all of this power to make all of the decisions about the land, et cetera, et cetera. If the government wants to come and negotiate with somebody about land, they have to come to just one person. Whereas if they recognize that all of these people here actually have rights in this land and should rightfully be consulted before we take their land, then you have to consult all of these people, right? And that's a really fraught process. And why I say that that's really important for contemporary purposes is that's what you're seeing with respect to extractive industry and with respect to a lot of communities who are being deprived of land for the purposes of development or foreign direct investment or whatever you're going to call it, right? Is sort of the centralization of power in individuals so that you can be able to get quicker and more efficient access to people's assets. Right.
Only one person to bribe, too.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
And I mean, that's really, that's how colonialism has proceeded, right? You create collaborators, and then they benefit from their collaboration, and so they're interested in maintaining that power structure because, they get to be the chief, and their children get to be the chief, and their grandchildren get to be the chief, and they're in no danger from anybody else because they're doing the bidding of, whoever's the district officer or whatever. But I mean, and I think you're right? This is how, if you think about colonialism in the United States too, right? The creation of tribes as an administrative unit, and the way in which the chief then becomes your contact point with the tribe, and so you can legislate who is entitled to what resources based on their tribal identity, which is supposedly primeval, right? And therefore you're able to impose a very, very sort of arbitrary kind of, but very specific way of thinking about resources that's connected to this idea of, the natives are like this, so we've got to, we're doing them a favor, right, by working with the customary systems. But the reality is that this is not a pre-colonial system. This is very much a hybrid system where particular people are getting advantaged, and so they're likely to, I mean, just like the guys in Kenya who are, this discourse about, well, this is the traditional African way where, men, powerful men have multiple wives, and again, it's like, you look historically, that's not the case, but it suits them to be able to make that argument.
And also in colonial times, you need to remember, like you were saying, Sindiso, like a lot of the stuff was going on as they go. So for them to premeditate, they would have had to bother learning African culture and trying to figure out how to place women, well, not really place women in positions of power, but how to work women into their structure, which would have required a lot of work and attention from their side. Whereas if they just came in with systems that they understood and transferred that into the African or the global South, that was way easier than dealing with the systems that already worked at the time.
So I guess just an answer to the second part of your question, unfortunately, I don't know that it bodes that well for the future. I mean, like, hopefully there are gains being made. I know, like, there are definitely people who are, struggling and advocating and continuously presenting the arguments, but I do actually think that this sort of challenge with respect to land and the sort of economics, again, sort of the political economy of, like, land and resources inland or subterranean resources, right, makes it so that these, the incentives to continue sort of patriarchy and continue these oppressive models of governance as being, these are the traditional systems and we've got to protect them at all costs, right, even though they're not actually traditional systems and they ultimately serve to reinforce and reenact forms of these sort of alliances between those who have power and those who don't, right? And or at least those who have power and those who have some power, like government and traditional leaders or whatever. The incentives are really great. And so what you see in South Africa right now actually is a lot of struggles around traditional leaders being in cahoots with the government over mining deals, over land deals, over all forms of resources, and being the ones who are kind of drivers in many ways and enforcers of dispossession and forced removals of people from their land, denigration and desecration of burial grounds, and all of these awful things, and it's largely because of economic interests and political alliances. So it's it's definitely a very difficult time. Carol, you had a question?
I have many, but one that just follows on the first part of that conversation. I'm wondering how much, and I know this is also an impossible question because there are so many different populations in South Africa that where the answer would be different. But nonetheless, I'm wondering how much the understanding that what gets described as customary or traditional, it has been so constructed by patriarchal colonial law in many ways. I mean, how much that conversation and that awareness is where in South Africa. I know that, for instance, in the U.S., which, in the U.S., that understanding is held by a very small percentage of the population in general, right? Is it a part of political discourse in South Africa?
Sure, no, not that I'm aware of. Like, I mean, I think it's mostly sort of happening in, like, the Ivory Tower, right?
Yeah.
And I think that South Africa has. My husband calls it civil high society, right? Because, like, you've got civil society in the form of, like, community-based organizations and what have you, and, like, I don't know that discourse is kind of pervasive there, but I think, like, civil high society, right? Like, you're sort of OSF funded, and Ford funded or whoever, right? Like those people are probably like more in the know with respect to that. But I think that by and large, it's actually a discourse that is offensive, right? Like if you say that to people, I think people find that really offensive because, firstly, the argument can be presented that you are essentially saying that like Black people couldn't create anything, and it is like white people are responsible even for the things that we hold dear, or it can be interpreted as like you are seeing, like, you are basically undermining the power now of us to determine our own sort of destinies and our own futures and what have you, and you're undermining traditional leaders is essentially undermining our custom, because they've basically taken the mantle of being custodians of our culture and custodians of our land and custodians of basically everything. And so, if you present that argument, the traditional leader lobby comes very strongly to its defense and says, you're basically kind of contaminated by the
West.
You're contaminated by the West. The Constitution is a Western document that was imported from Canada, and we are you're basically just kind of a pawn to undermine. What's that?
It's the Robert Mugabe argument.
In large part, yeah. No, it really is in large part. And so, it's a really difficult argument to make in a way that is sensitive and will not sort of get people's backs up. And most people, to be honest, are literally just trying to survive, right? So that's the other difficulty, is like, how do you get those conversations going in communities where people are literally just trying to survive? And women are so responsible for most of that labor of trying to survive, right? Like basically trying to like collect firewood and collect water, and and so most of the women that I've talked to are like, we don't have the luxury of going to these spaces and having these conversations. So I think one of the things that we are not doing very well as scholars and activists and people in civil society or people in like funding organizations or development organizations or whatever, is going to the places where women are, rather than like calling them to like meetings and saying, you need to come and tell us the information, right? Because you can't really take people out of their lives like that, and in those circumstances, in those contexts, it's just not that easy, right? It's like, oh yeah, come on over to like a public meeting, right? And so I think that's something that we definitely could do better for the purposes of trying to sort of get these conversations going.
At least provide childcare.
That's true, right? At least provide childcare, at the very least, right? Yeah.
One place where I see some cause for optimism about this, and that's in grassroots organizations like Abahlali Basemndlondlo, which is a tenants organization that's based in the cities. So it's a very, very different context from the one that you're talking about. But I think that there are people there who are actively, like you say, struggling to assert their rights against the ANC and against traditional rulers and other people who have political and economic power, because they don't have any, right? And so in these contexts, you start to see people organizing and people talking about rights and people really, enacting those things and they're getting targeted for assassination in consequence, right? So they're clearly upsetting people. They're clearly having an effect. And I think the long-term consequence of that grassroots organization is actually, that's one place where I think you could possibly see the growth of something a little bit more positive. But these sort of state top-down mechanisms are much more unwieldy and much more easily co-opted than some of these other things, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad. Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, I'm glad that you raised that, because I do think that that's really important to recognize, is that people are struggling on the ground. And so we've worked with the Rural Women's Movement for one, and Land Access Movement of South Africa, and all of these organizations who are doing a ton of this sort of on the ground struggling. But like you say, it's really tenuous because firstly, like they don't have resources to support them, and they don't have the political power and platform that others have to be able to speak. And when they do, actually, like the violence is real, right? Like people's lives are genuinely under threat. And so, recently the documentary This Land was produced about a community in KwaZulu-Natal that is struggling against evictions, and the people there like have actually been threatened by their traditional leader, and people have actually been assassinated, and so these are really very difficult times for people who are trying to struggle on the ground, especially because there just aren't very many resources to support them. And within the context of like all of the noise on the global stage, right? Like it's really hard for them to get traction for their arguments. And so in some cases it feels like they're sort of just like working in the dark, yeah.
I just kind of wanted to maybe pose a question and have us think about, Chris, you spoke about the grassroots organizing, and there's a lot of that obviously going on in South Africa. One of the things that I find completely energizing about being there. But then my only experience of South Africa has been primarily in urban settings. And I wanted to find out whether, so when people migrate from rural communities and come to urban settings, in some ways they are separated from those traditional structures in rural communities, power structures in rural communities, and the uprooting can create new forms of alliances which sort of lead to this grassroots organizing in urban settings. And I wonder what one can say about the potential for grassroots organizing within rural communities where there's not that kind of turnover and uprooting and instability, and whether traditional structures tend to be more predominant there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that it offers opportunities and constraints, right? And so one of the things so the opportunity is, of course, like you're there and like you can be really invested, sort of long term or whatever. But one of the things that I'm interested in this project, or the sort of bigger project, is the bigger book project is the fact of the ways in which intimacy of relationships affects conflicts. Right. And that's, I think, the main sort of constraint is the fact that because you're there, you kind of develop a persona, and if you are targeted and ostracized and seen to be an enemy within the gates, that can have very, very serious consequences for you and your family. And so in some ways, like, being able to move offers some, avenues of respite. And so it's kind of a tricky situation. And so I mentioned this documentary, This Land, and one of the primary sort of activists in that documentary, he is living in this community, is continuing to live in this community, but he says, like, I fear for my life, right? Like I've been threatened, I've been hauled before the traditional court for things that I have or haven't done, or things that are legitimate or illegitimate or whatever. And so his life is sort of in the balance, and because of the fact that he is so embedded there, it means that he can continue the struggle, but it also means that he
Everybody knows where he lives.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's interesting to me because I've seen the grassroots organizations within the townships and within the cities, but I've never actually thought about it from a rural area. And I kind of understand now when they were doing a political debate, and one of the officials of the ANC was arguing with the EFF, and they were saying there's a distinct difference between someone who lives in the township and someone who lives in the rural area, because
there's continuity and sustainability within the township because you can congregate way closer, so it's easier to understand what their rights are there. Whereas in rural areas, because they're so spread out, that it becomes a problem to come up with these organizing tools and keep up to make sure that this area or this specific sector has the same needs or wants as the next sector. So that was very interesting to me. And then it's kind of also made me understand the difference, because I keep hearing the difference between the born-frees and the ones that aren't born-frees, and I've never quite understood it, but I now get it from a rural versus urban setting. Yeah.
A lot of the debate in South Africa today is about the fact that the born-frees aren't actually born that free, right? Because of the fact that transformation just hasn't been that significant, and actually poverty continues to rise, and poverty is still very, very unequally spread in terms of 1% of the white population was beneath the poverty line in terms of the 2015 Statistics South Africa data, as compared to I can't remember 53% of the black population. So yeah, it's tricky. But of course, indeed, the rural-urban divide is very legitimate, right? Because of the fact that the mobilizing, even just in terms of the image that I showed, right? How dispersed the places are, mobilization in those contexts is very, very difficult. If only because of transportation, such a basic thing, right? Even just people traveling from their homes to get to the chief's court is, a long distance. So you're either having to walk for hours, or you're having to come up with the money to, pay for a taxi. But paying for a taxi, where's that money coming from? It's probably coming from one of these social grant sources. And are you really going to take some of your child grant or your pension grant that's feeding your family to use towards, taking a taxi to go and have a case at the chief's court? Or, to the extent that we care about participation, right? Are you going to take those resources to go to the chief's court for the purposes of participating in discussion about how you should reform and improve your community, right? It's a really tall order. It's a big ask of people who are literally just trying to get by.
Potentially, this is one area where mobile technology could actually make a difference, right? But I think you need all of these other pieces of infrastructure in place in order to be able to do that successfully. And so the tech bros are really, they're really gung-ho about, the very easy parts of the equation, but there's all of these social and political and economic other aspects that need to be in place alongside the technology in order to make it work. But it seems to me that is one place where potentially you could actually make some real differences if you had the right supports in place.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there definitely are organizations that are working on that, and so that is definitely an avenue potential. We'll see.